All right. Well, let's talk a little bit more about your podcast.
Mhm.
This is, I guess, a force for good here because you are providing a platform for like actual sex workers to talk about their actual work and to highlight that it isn't all of the scary vice type things that we hear
No.
about in the news. How has that been going? Like, tell us about how this has been a force for good in the world.
I mean, I truly have learned so much about porn through this that I never had any idea about.
Mm,
Just there's so many reasons why people get into porn and so many experiences. I've had a performer who felt like she was a lesbian her whole life, but married a man. And then her first time hooking up with a woman was at 50 years old on set for a porn
on
scene.
set.
That was her
Wow.
first porn scene ever. And it's just
Yeah.
like, it's so meaningful. I just feel like there's so many ways that porn and sex work as a whole are just can be such good outlets for people to really get out of their situation. I had another performer, Maria Riot, from the favelas in Buenos Aires, and she went to Europe to shoot porn and got rejected at the border, I believe 2 or 3 times. It had to fly back to Argentina from Spain, which is, believe, like a 15-hour flight.
Yeah,
And
geez.
ultimately, eventually got in and made a huge porn career. And now they have 80,000 followers on Instagram and they're this known performer all over. So I just feel like there's so many stories about porn. And I think that's really like the most important thing to me about it, just to get it out, because most people don't know about what porn's like in Tokyo. They know it
Mm.
exists, obviously, but having someone like Katie Kanako come on and talk to me about what her experience is as a femdom in Japanese porn is just so interesting to me, because you just get all this information that's so contrary to the idea that everyone in porn is in LA or Vegas, essentially.
Yeah, and there's so much about just human sexuality that I think we assume is innate, that is like locked into our biology, and to recognize that there's very little genetically different between the folks who are living here and the folks that are living in Tokyo or Berlin or these
Yeah.
other places, and yet their attitudes around I mean, yes, around like pornography and sex work, but also just around like garden variety sexual questions, issues of modesty, or
Hmm.
like what's we talked recently about what's appropriate within families, like when is nudity appropriate or not appropriate. Those are questions that are being answered in different ways all
Hmm.
over the world. And so spending some time acknowledging how much of this is culture rather than biology is fascinating. I actually found myself like really scratching my head as I was listening to some of the conversations that you've had on that show, amazed at how broad and big the world of sexuality is.
Yeah. It's something I honestly didn't expect. I feel like particularly just learning that Berlin porn was so rooted in just making art, because Berlin's always been a creative city. That's where Bowie and Iggy Pop went to make all their weird experimental stuff. Like, rent's cheap to nothing there. Like, that whole scene spawn there is just so cool to me. And I just feel like there's so many of these different porn movements that really happen throughout the world. And I just feel like they need to be acknowledged as genuine art movements like they are.
Hmm. Well, the performers pod itself. I mean, who is that show for? Who would enjoy that, and who do you see as sort of your market or your target?
I don't even know if I have a target or audience for it. I just want to give a place for performers to talk about that stuff, whether it's people in our own industry listening to it and learning from that, or if it's outsiders who want to know more about their favorite performer. I just think that when you do like an hour podcast with someone, when you listen to it, you're going to get a fairly decent idea of who they are as a person.
Hmm.
And I feel like we don't really have that in many opportunities in porn.
Yeah, I mean, in a certain sense, it feels like inside the actor's studio, but for porn performers, and I really appreciate that because there are so many opportunities for us to learn about our favorite Avenger or our favorite pitcher or our favorite singer songwriter and
Mhm.
these kinds of things, and these are people too, right?
Yeah, I was actually really inspired by it's called Just Women Sports. It's a podcast that is hosted by one of the U.S. women's national team members, and she just interviews other women athletes, and they just talk about kind of the whole experiences and all these amazing things these athletes did. And I want to bring that to porn because there's all these performers who've done amazing things in our industry, like winning major awards, touring around the world, and all this stuff. I feel like we never really talk about porn in a serious way. So if I can be that person to tell a performer, wow, you're really part of this movement, you've done everything you essentially could, I'm glad that I can, Like, I
Yeah.
just think it needs to be taken seriously like that.
Yeah, well, what kind of impact do you feel you've had so far? I mean, I know it's still somewhat new and
Yeah.
early, but what's it been like? How's it been received?
It's been good so far. I just kind of wanted to create something, and honestly, without these industry events really happening anymore, there isn't the same sense of community. So
Sure.
I think just having these experiences where I can talk to someone about their own career in a way they've never been able to, it really gives both me, like, just selfishly in the interview, a sense of community, being like, wow, there's all these other people who are doing the same thing around the world and have
Hmm.
the same goals. And I just think that for me is like the biggest thing. I think there has been a lot of really good feedback. I had Magdalene St. Michael's on. She told me everything about her life, and it was amazing. She revealed plastic surgeries on the podcast that no one knew about. And I'm just like, I just love that I gave a space for that, that her fans can be like, oh, wow, I didn't know this about her. I didn't know about her experience with coming out as gay or bisexual. Like, I just think it's so important to just give performers a space.
Yeah. Well, what sort of challenges have you run into? I mean, has there been any sort of pushback from like publishers or anything along those lines?
I've had a few people get mad about what other people said in the podcast.
Sure.
So they came at me with it, but in all those cases, they later were like, "Can I go on your podcast?" And I'm like, "Yeah, sure, of course." So I think yeah, honestly, the biggest issue has been Wi-Fi in Europe is very spotty in certain places. So
Sure.
some of the episodes, I interviewed Esperanza Del Horno, who's in Amsterdam, and we were doing it during a thunderstorm, so their Wi-Fi went out multiple times. So that was pretty challenging. Or people staying at hotels with terrible Wi-Fi. So
Hmm.
that's kind of been the only issue, but there hasn't really been that much backlash. I've only had one or two people ever go in my DMs about it, and both times I ended up going on the podcast and wanting to talk. So
Yeah, I wish we had that same opportunity with some of our trolls. Like, really, you're upset with what we said about how trans kids should be protected? Like, why don't you come on the show? We don't have those types of trolls. We don't have that opportunity in the same way.
yeah, I'm just like, I just want to put the truth out there. Like, if you
Hmm.
choose not to believe it and you choose to believe all the porn tropes, you do you. But like, I just want to put this narrative out there. So
Yeah,
if
give
someone doesn't
people a
really want to
chance to
know
just
about it,
meet you as a person.
yeah, for sure. And I think you can appreciate people more as a performer when you realize kind of what goes into it and just kind of the story behind it. I just feel like there's so many performers with amazing stories that are just not recognized. Jessie Lee, for example, is a really amazing alt porn performer, one of the first people in tattooed porn with Joanna Angel. And she's on the way to a convention, and she got into a really bad car wreck, basically lost the ability to nearly everything, and then moved to California, was staying on Joanne Angel's couch for like I think 2 months recovering, and then the next year got nominated for like 3 AVN awards. And it's just like that's such an amazing story and
Yeah.
such an amazing storyline that you wouldn't usually think of with porn because you're not thinking of these storylines. You're not thinking of it on that level. It's just like, oh, there's a porn performer that happened to them, whatever. But I think if you really look at these performers' stories and where they came from, I think there's a lot of really inspiring stuff that can apply way more outside of just in the porn world.
Yeah, no, if this was a different form of media, a story like that would be front page of TMZ, or it would be, getting talked about on the E network, or these kinds of
Yeah.
things. And porn performers deserve to exist in spaces like those.
Yeah, I think the Olympics are a very good example. All these sports, no one genuinely cares about most of the time.
Sure.
It's only when the like NBC puts out these packages that's like, this is this
People don't
person's
keep up with
inspiring
like speed
story.
skating and curling until there's, these narratives and this sort of like
Exactly.
national coming together. Sure.
Yeah. If I can create that narrative for someone and make them realize how important that is and
Mm.
write that storyline for them on my podcast, essentially, like, that just makes me so happy because you could do that, the press could do that, but I feel like people don't wanna take porn seriously enough to do it, but there's all the same stories and deeper stories in porn.
Yeah.
So, yeah,
Well,
that's, like, probably the thing I'm most proud of with the podcast.
no doubt, no doubt. I absolutely see, why you're motivated to keep the show going and why this
Yeah.
feels important. Do you have any favorite moments from the show so far that you'd like to call out?
I mean, the Magdalene St. Michael's release, like, talking about all their plastic surgeries, that was really amazing. I was just like, "Wow, I you didn't need to go that." I've had a few moments where people kinda shocked me. There was, I believe it's the Esperanza podcast where they named another performer and there's like, "Yeah, she's a bitch." I'm just like I'm like, "If she's in my DMs, I'm sending her your way." I'm not responsible for that. Talking to a director that I worked with, Nika Noel, was probably one of my favorite episodes. We worked together so many times and gotten awards for our work together. And I just never really sat down and had a conversation away from set and really get where they were coming from and just kind of understand their experiences. So that was really personally really important to me. I think the Maria Riot one is very interesting. And the Raquel Roper one, I think is really cool just to hear multiple generations of sex workers. I just think that's like the coolest thing. Also, for storyline for Sin Sage, they had like a major hip surgery and then came back to porn and won an AVN. Like, there's just so many amazing stories that I feel like have been on the podcast. So
Yeah, I can't even think about how many like dumb hours of my life I have wasted at bars or like hanging out at my dad's restaurant before it opened or whatever else, just watching Sports Center go through these like perfunctory narratives, and we're hearing about some so and so's ACL was torn, and can you believe that like they're back at it?
yeah.
And you're right, we don't have those same conversations in this space, and it's deserving, and there's like real value, I think, in shining that light.
Yeah, I mean, controversial take. I think porn stars are athletes, but I
Yeah.
don't I don't know if it's gonna be on ESPN anytime soon, but I just feel like in general though, like the way you have to really keep your body in shape, just have your body to do these like super specialized things that most people can't do. I think it's just very much fits into that. And for me, I've gotten really into sports psychology because it just really applies to it because you have to be able to, get into the right mental space no matter what's happening on set, essentially. No matter if it's 2 a.m. and your flight was delayed, like when you have to perform, you have to be able to do that. So I think really just working on mental health stuff has been so big for me to be able to do that.
Yeah, yeah, that comparison to sports psychology makes good sense to me. How do you
I
feel ultimately about what you've accomplished, and the work that still needs to be done here?
Um, as far as like activism, I'm really pretty stoked with where porn is right now. AVN has award Grand Rail, that's the biggest film of the night, biggest award of the night, and a trans person won it for a trans film this last year.
Hmm.
And there's little to no pushback, which makes me feel so great that there's really no ceiling for trans women in this industry anymore. When I came into the industry, there was still slurs and trans women were really excluded from other parts of porn. And I think
Hmm.
it's changed a lot in the last 7 years during my career, and I'm really glad that I was able to be part of it with my petition to get rid of slurs and pushing for inclusion. Personally, I'm feeling really good right now.
Yeah,
Just like career wise, yeah, it's going good. I won best trans cam performer at the Why Not Cam Awards in October in Hollywood, which was really fun.
Yeah, no, congratulations.
Thanks.
I should mention that I think you kind of came onto my radar for the first time when we were having a conversation about some of the slurs that have traditionally been used on tube sites and these different
Yeah.
things around trans performers,
Hmm.
and how significant and I want to say kind of sweeping that changes, because when we were talking about it as a crew, like behind the scenes, everybody was sort of acknowledging that, like, depending on how old they were or how long they had been like around porn, that they didn't even know that that was a thing. That
Oh
it
yeah,
wasn't, they weren't even aware of the fact that you would have some of these terms in, big banner marquees on the
for
front
sure.
page of Pornhub and every other site.
I mean, the first award show I went to was literally named the Tranny Awards. Like,
Yeah.
it's so different now. Yeah, it's just so day and night. I'm just so glad it's moved to a more inclusive space. And yeah, I feel like I can just kind of exist as a performer now. And yeah, it feels like everything's going in a really good direction. So I'm really positive about where porn's going. It's just
Hmm. Well,
the
the like
rest of the
the
world.
yeah, well, so like the BBC story that we mentioned at the
Mhm.
top, and things along those lines, do you feel like porn is starting to become perhaps more progressive than other forms of media, or breaking free in a way, or
Yeah.
how should we conceive of that?
Yeah, I mean, there's no other place that trans women are winning the biggest thing without half of everyone freaking the hell out and being like,
Some
"We
kind of
can't have trans people
asterisk
here."
or yeah.
Yeah, so I think I'm really lucky that I'm in an industry that is now in a place that, there's no real ceiling to being a trans woman in porn. I think porn's focus really needs to start being a more racial equity. I think it's starting to get better in the last few years, but I think there's still a lot of work to be done where there's more Black and POC performers winning major awards, which really hasn't happened historically because Avian's been
Mm-hmm.
around for nearly 40 years now. So there's like really historical precedents for it just not being as inclusive as it needs to be.
Yeah, no, I hear that. And if I may, I'm actually going to borrow something from your podcast and ask you if you could wave your magic wand and
Ugh.
change one thing about the porn industry overnight, like that miracle question. Is that the thing? What else would you maybe mention as something you would like to see change in the industry?
I just want everything to speed up 5 years because I
Mm,
think studios will lose basically all power. I think there'll be some directors still who are truly like artistic and truly doing something for performers as opposed to just kind of booking them and saying, "Oh yeah, go fuck over there, it's fine." Like we're just going to get the shots, it doesn't matter if it looks good. I think that's what I want. I just want all of it to yeah, just continuously evolve so content trade has more and more power. So
hmm.
that's always my answer, just because I feel like it's going to solve so many things as far as transphobia, racism in porn, because you're actually having performers working with other performers. I think that's what really gives me the most hope about porn is the decentralization of it.
Yeah, I find that fascinating because I don't disagree. Like I can't argue with you on any point, and yet my very limited training in sociology, it feels like in so many other spheres, when we do have decentralization and that sort of democratization, that people often tend to clutter in their same little like bigoted, homogenous groups, and yet in porn, it does seem to have this incredible power to normalize different types of bodies, different, types of hair and skin and everything
Mhm.
else.
Yeah, I think it's really important just that it's going to be more inclusive because it's just all by the performers.
Mhm.
And yeah, I just don't want any CEO or whatever making bank off my performance. And especially in your earlier performances, like as a new performer, you're getting relatively paid nothing to what they're making off of you.
Sure.
So I
Yeah.
think just being able to own all your own work is so important. And I think whether you're a musician, a filmmaker, I think you should be able to own your own work no matter what. And I think that's the biggest thing I can say to any artist. Just try to get the rights to your own work. And that's why it makes me really hopeful for the future of porn because I don't think it's going to be based on a studio offering you $1,000 or $2,000 to do a scene.
Glad to hear that that we're seeing change here.
Yeah.
For folks listening, whether they are performers or aspiring performers themselves, or anybody else who is paying attention, are there any websites or organizations or other resources that you'd like to shout out?
Yeah, my company I work for is Trouble Films. We've been making queer porn for, I believe the company's been doing it for like 12 years now.
Hmm.
So I've been working for them since I moved to the Bay. So I think about 7 years, and Sin Sage is there. Katie Kanako, who I mentioned earlier, is on Trouble Films, and that's where all my work essentially is. Yeah, the Performers Pod, you can find it on Spotify. You can find it on Apple Podcasts, kind of everywhere. But yeah, I think that's most of my plugs right now.
Yeah. No, thank you. Thank you so much.